Have you ever slipped on a patch of ice or a puddle of water? And not just, like a little slide. Have you ever wiped out? 1 second you're standing up and the next you're on the ground? Well, I have, and I don't recommend it. But it can make for an interesting story. It happened to me one unusually busy day in December of 2019, right around lunchtime. I had a long to-do list because I was leaving for a trip the next day, or at least that's what I thought. I'd gone out to grab a quick lunch, and it had been pouring rain all day long. And that caused a puddle to form on the floor of the restaurant where I was going. And as I rounded the corner from the sidewalk into the restaurant, I didn't see the puddle, even though it was right in front of me. After my crash landing, I realized that I wasn't going on my trip the next day because I was going to the emergency room. I had started the day full of motivation and energy and in high spirits, but just not open enough to the possibilities that the day held for me. Possibilities like breaking my arm and dislocating my elbow. And so I spent the next few weeks in doctor's offices, in the operating room, and a lot of it in a chair in my living room, napping, from the pain medication, having some weird dreams, including a few about Santa Claus for some reason. But one long afternoon in the chair, a thought, really a question popped into my head. What have I learned from this? Well, don't break your arm is good advice, but it seems kind of obvious, right? So I really wanted to get something out of this, right? Like I wanted to learn something valuable, and so I kept at it, and you know what? I came up with something pretty good. Want to hear it? Always wear the right shoes. I stand by this advice, too, because I mentioned that it had been raining all day, right? But despite that, I was in such a rush to get out the door that I had put on loafers, slick-bottom loafers. You're probably asking, what was I thinking? Well, I can tell you what I was thinking. I was thinking about all the stuff I had to do that day. I was thinking about the trip the next day. In fact, I was thinking about the whole month ahead of me, which was very busy and full of interesting stuff, and it all seemed very real to me. And as a result of that, I did not make a good decision. I made a bad decision, and I didn't wear the right shoes. What I didn't know was that soon we'd all be wearing our shoes a whole lot less. At that time, in January of 2020, I ran a company that sold tickets to live events like concerts and sports and theater, stuff like that. I'd started it with my two best friends some years before, and we'd grown it to a pretty good size. When COVID shut down China in January of 2020, which we all remember, it got everybody's attention, but we took special notice because our business had one key structural flaw in the business model. I really hate to use a lot of jargon, but in order for us to sell tickets to events had to happen. Clearly, there were no events happening in China at that time, but in January, that still seemed kind of far away and not quite real. I compare it to, if you've ever done this, putting your ear to a railroad track. And sometimes if you do that, you can hear a train coming from a long way off. And even if you know it's really coming, you can't see it and it doesn't quite seem real. But that's where we start our story, Act 1, playing chicken with the train. In late January, our customer service team started to track the number of questions we were getting each day about COVID. And for weeks, we didn't get any at all. It was 0. By mid-February, we started to get a handful of questions, but I didn't worry. Why? Because I'm an optimist. It's true. I'm an optimist. And when I really think about that, I don't really know why I'm an optimist. Interesting. Because it turns out that our mental outlook is largely determined by the brain that we're born with and a lot of the experiences that we have when we're young. And those are things that you really don't control or choose. Still, it turns out that being an optimist is mostly a good thing. There's research to back me up on this. Dr. Sonia Lubermisky at the University of California cites a number of really positive correlations between optimism and happiness and other good life outcomes. And there's some research, too, that even says, and I think this is kind of strange, a positive outlook can actually reduce your perception of physical pain. And I would add, very non-scientifically, that optimism can sometimes be give you that little dash of self-delusion that you sometimes need to make crazy new ideas work. It's basically what Silicon Valley runs on. So as an optimist, I looked on the bright side of life, like Monty Python, and as February went on, not much really changed. Sure, we were getting a few more questions about COVID each day, concerns, that kind of thing, but sales were still good. In fact, sales were great. People were binge buying toilet paper, but they were also binge buying Hamilton tickets, and we had both. But then the calendar turned to March. The NBA suspended its season. Broadway shut down, even Hamilton. Shows were canceling in waves all across the country. We went from selling tickets to unselling tickets. And so begins Act 2, the train wreck. Back when I had my accident in the restaurant, I remember there was this tiny little moment where I knew that I was falling, but I hadn't hit the ground yet. Strangely, I was having that feeling again, except this time with our business. Every customer question was about COVID now. Every venue and producer in the country was shutting down. Every show we were selling was going to be canceled, and every ticket we'd already sold was going to be refunded. We had no idea how long this was going to last, but it was pretty clear it wasn't going to end anytime soon. Here's an actual sales chart from that period. Oh, sure, it's funny now. But it was very serious for us. We'd spent nearly 20 years building the business. We had 150 employees who depended on the company for their livelihood, and thousands of partners who turned to us to find customers and generate revenue. But now our revenue had gone to zero, and our industry that we relied upon had essentially ceased to exist. Not just that, but for weeks, keeping up with the cancellations and the refunds and the customer questions and the panicked partners was more than a full-time job. We were in so far over our heads. We were cooped up at home like so many other people, living our own sort of business tragedy inside the much larger human tragedy of the pandemic itself. And it was at this time that something changed for me. And I know that because I have a snippet from my journal back then. I find myself still optimistic about getting through this, but also mildly depressed. Hey, maybe mild depression is an appropriate response to the situation. If I were whistling "Don't Worry, Be Happy" right now, that would just prove I'm an idiot. This may be the exact moment that I developed what I call a sense of tragedy. Actually, let's take an intermission, shall we, and talk about tragedy. The thing that had my accident with my arm is what you might call a minor personal tragedy. You know, it was bad, but if you saw the surveillance video, you might laugh. You know, you feel guilty, but you might laugh. It's fine. Nevertheless, it was bad enough to provide me with really good material for developing a sense of tragedy. That's what I call the wisdom that comes from understanding that terrible things really can happen, specifically to you, or in this case, to me. For better or worse, optimists sometimes downplay or even dismiss these negative possibilities. People with a well-developed sense of tragedy do not. I know what you're asking. Jim, have you just gone to the other side? Are you now saying it's best to simply assume the worst? Well, I don't think so. First of all, it's tough to be around that person, right? But also, it turns out that science demonstrates it's tough to be that person. Research in the Clinical Psychology Review makes a number of very strong correlations between a chronic pessimistic outlook and all kinds of bad outcomes like worse health, lower income, worse relationships, and giving up on things more easily, which sounds like a lot to deal with. Nonetheless, I do believe that a healthy pessimism really does have something to teach us optimists. The ancient Greeks knew that tragedy was useful. They didn't do those plays because they were just toga-wearing downers. Aristotle said that tragedy reacquaints us with pity and fear, and that when we experienced tragedy on a stage, we went through what was called catharsis, where we experienced a feeling of uplift and got a clear idea of reality itself. And so a sense of tragedy comes from contact with tragedy, whether big or small, real or fictional. Life will typically provide you with all the material that you need, but in order to benefit from it, you have to be open to what tragedy has to teach. Sometimes optimists are not. Sometimes when an optimist hears the train coming from a long way off, he plays chicken with it. People with a well-developed sense of tragedy just get off the track. Okay, intermission is over, and we're on to Act 3. Now that you're dead, what are you going to do with your life? The COVID train blew through our business and the whole live entertainment industry like it was a popsicle stand. And then we cleaned up the mess. The crisis of shutdowns and cancellations ended, and then there was just silence. The silence of empty venues all over the world. The worst possible thing that could happen to our business had happened, but we were still here. It was kind of liberating, actually. We still had some time and a talented team to fight for our business and for our whole industry. We learned in COVID how much people love getting together for games and shows and concerts because COVID took it away. And a lot of people were very eager to be able to get back to the point, to get through the pandemic so they could get together in those places again. But let me tell you, in spring of 2020, whether the organizations and institutions that provide that would survive till the end of the pandemic was very much TBD. So, despite that, it must be said, it did actually make us better in some ways. As an industry, people got more creative. They invented stuff like car concerts and online events and COVID-safe ticketing that really showed people working with a higher energy and purpose than maybe ever before. As a company, we got more careful. We traded in our summer loafers for some winter galoshes. In this much more dangerous environment, in this long shutdown, we had to get much more careful very quickly, and we did. And personally, I just got better at seeing what was right in front of me. For example, did you know that there's a clan of acorn woodpeckers in the tree across from my house? Probably not. I'd be really surprised if you did. But neither did I until March of 2020, even though I'd lived in the house for 10 years. For 10 years, I just looked past them. There they were, every day, 6 of them squawking their heads off, colorful and fantastic, but I didn't see them. My mind was just somewhere else. Here's how Act 3 ends. The company did survive. In spring of 21, the live entertainment industry started slowly to come back, and so did we. We later sold the company and launched another company that we had built during the pandemic, and both are still operating today. But this is not a business fairy tale. This isn't one of those stories, that you read on LinkedIn or other places where people face ridiculous odds and they triumph and they all become tycoons. This is a story of fighting like hell, fighting tragedy to a hard-earned draw. This is about just looking the forces of destruction in the eye and saying, you're just not going to beat me. And even though there are lessons to be learned from experiences like this, there's an important caveat that I really want to add. Tragedy is not a self-help program. We all know what COVID did. It destroyed lives and disrupted careers and fractured families, and whatever lessons we may have learned from that, the price was still incredibly high. Every crisis may be an opportunity, as I often heard people say during the pandemic, but you know what else it is? It's a crisis. There's that song in Les Mis that some of you may know, where Fantine sings, "There are dreams that cannot be, and there are storms we cannot weather." It's a harsh line, but there's a certain pessimistic wisdom in it. You can't deny that she's right sometimes. But that's not how the show ends. That's not where the story ends. The story ends with a question. What happens when tomorrow comes? What does the future hold for us, for any of us? Well, of course, nobody really knows. But if you put your ear to the track, you can kind of hear it coming. Some of it is going to be great. And some of it is going to be different from what we want. And even though we can't stop it, we're not helpless either. When it comes to the things that really matter to you, the things that count the most, Be as much of an optimist as your nature allows. And that'll give you the power to imagine a future that you want from the starting point of the present that you've got. And it might just give you that little smidge of self-delusion that you sometimes need to succeed. And if you're an optimist like me, see what happens when you listen to your inner pessimist just a little bit more. Allow that voice to teach you a sense of tragedy that will keep you open to the possibility of puddles and pandemics. And then whoever you are, dream a dream of a future that makes you want to rush out the door in the morning, even when it's pouring rain. But always wear the right shoes.